Folks, 2014 is probably going to be described as the year of the faith-based film. We've talked about a lot of them over the course of the show, and Exodus, Gods and Kings is yet another example of Hollywood throwing out one of these films, trying to cash in on this trend. And as we discussed previously, we had him on again. Author of Chronicles of the Nephilim, David Ascendant is his most recent novel. He's a screenwriter. He's had a great success and a great career already, and kind of an expert on these kinds of things. Brian Godawa, how are you doing, Brian?
Good, man. How are you?
Oh, it's so great having you back with us again. And let's get right to Exodus, and let's just start with kind of a brief overview of your thoughts, and then we'll kind of pick apart some different topics and that kind of thing. What were your general thoughts of this film?
Well, I went in to the movie trying to have an open mind because after the abysmal failure of Noah, the Antichrist message in Noah, environmentalist earth worship and all that, I thought Ridley Scott is a better filmmaker than Darren Aronofsky. He's at least going to tell a better story, even if I don't totally agree with his interpretation, right? And this is the filmmaker of Alien and Gladiator. So I'm expecting, I'm not going to agree with everything, but maybe he's a good storyteller. Maybe he'll stay true to the story, and I'll give it a chance. And unfortunately, we had those statements by Christian Bale beforehand, his nutty statements about Moses was schizophrenic and barbaric. And, I thought, well, that could just be actors. Actors are stupid, and sometimes they say stupid things. And I'm thinking, it may not necessarily be what the movie is. But I went in watching the movie with this, hoping it would be something good to find. And I got to say, it was very disappointing on many different levels, not the least of which was the, just the actual movie storytelling itself. I think that it's probably one of Ridley Scott's worst movies that he's made. So it really isn't a great movie. It's a good movie, but it's not great, And for all the money that they spent on it, I think it was a waste, But I think, that's, on one level you've got the craft and then you've got the meaning. We can talk about the meaning in a second. But in terms of the craft, the problem is, I think, too, is casting Christian Bale as Moses was a big mistake. I think he's a great actor for certain kinds of parts, usually parts where he plays some cold, detached person, because Christian Bale is cold and unemotional in his acting. And so, like American Psycho or Dark Knight, he worked great in. But Moses in the Bible is a very passionate character. He has passionate ups and passionate downs. And yeah, he argues with God, but he also loves God, and he has a passionate relationship with him, which I think would be a very powerful human drama to explore, a relational drama going on there between God and Moses. But unfortunately, Christian Bale is just so removed that even his romantic relationship with Zipporah, the romance in the movie, is just dry and dead as all get out. So I think it was a bad casting choice for him.
Well, and I think that one is just one of many big, big mistakes by Ridley Scott in this. And I described the film, folks, if you read my review, as bland and long-winded. And part of the romance story was definitely a big contributor to that. It just becomes something you just absolutely do not care anything about. It just wasn't handled real well. Christian Bale, of course, is very stoic, very much the warrior, which was kind of part of what I think they were trying to transform Moses into. But on the casting side, the other thing that I think that really bothered me was we went through all the trouble to have some big-name actors in this film.
Yeah.
And one notable was Ben Kingsley, who's just a phenomenal actor. But there were no scenes for any actors to sort of stretch their legs. There are no Oscar scenes in this film. There were no moments in the script for any of these actors to sort of exercise their chops. Am I right?
Yeah, you're right there. Aaron Paul shows up as Joshua and says almost nothing. Ridley Scott's famous female actress, what's her name?
Sigourney Weaver, right?
Sigourney Weaver, yeah. She shows up and doesn't, I don't even think she says but two words. And Ben Kingsley has a couple scenes where he's fantastic in. But really, I think Joel Edgerton really does take the whole show with him. He does do a great job. I felt that the trailers showed really weak cuts of him, and I was really expecting a weak Pharaoh from him. But I think that was just a matter of the trailer, because he ended up really being the best cast in the whole movie. You know.
Yeah, he was really the only one given any real good character development and character transformation, and actually to a fault, right? I mean, isn't he really the only character that we're supposed to empathize with? I mean, we're really supposed to kind of feel like he's sort of like okay to be the dictator. We sort of like understand how he feels because he's the only character that's given that sort of perspective to.
Yeah, and Moses is so removed that we never connect with him as a viewer. It's just he's cold and removed, and I just don't relate to him, you know? Plus, well, we'll get into the God thing in a second, but yeah, you know, and so you're right, that at the end of the day, the only really sympathetic character other than Ben Kingsley, who shows up in 2 scenes, right, is, you're right, it's Pharaoh. And I think that I don't know that was deliberate. I would like to think it wasn't. But you know, who knows on the other hand, because the whole movie is ultimately it does subvert the Bible. I think in a more subtle way maybe than in some ways more subtle than Noah, and in other ways more explicit. So, you know, and I think at the heart of it, at the heart of the whole drama of Exodus, Gods and Kings, you know, to Ridley Scott, he sees it as a story between two brother-like men, Moses and Pharaoh. They're both raised by, Moses and Ramses were both raised by the Pharaoh, and Moses was, of course, adopted, and so he becomes a general. And I have no problem with that. That was actually cool. You know, it's an action movie. I do that in my biblical novels. You know, I have Abraham as a warrior, and I have Noah as a warrior, so I don't have a problem with that as long as it fits in with the Bible. And the Bible doesn't say what Moses was under Egypt, so that's okay. But the problem is that to Ridley Scott, to him, that's the story. Mm-hmm. These men, and then when Moses discovers he's a Jew, he starts to be pulled apart from Ramses. Yeah, that's fine. That's all good. I get that. That's cool. That's a good, you need that in the story. But the problem is that this is a sacred story. The Moses story in the Bible is a sacred story. And ultimately, the people who love this story love it for its essential heart message, which is really more the relationship between, God and his people, quite frankly.
Right.
But more focused, God and Moses.
Yeah.
And sadly, the movie is completely devoid of any relationship, any love, any promises from God. You know, it's all just, and this is where we sort of launch into the God thing. You know, it's a cold, uncaring movie, and the God in it is cold and uncaring, and there's no relationship between Moses and God. It's just this sort of, God shows up every once in a while with a vision telling him what to do, and Moses thinks he's crazy, and Moses wonders if he's seeing crazy visions and delusions. He's not even sure. In the entire movie, he's never sure. And so it's just this strange, humanistic, atheistic interpretation of religion. And that's the point. Ridley Scott is an atheist director. His writers were atheists. So it doesn't surprise me that even if they try, it doesn't surprise me that if they're going to retell a Bible story, they're going to spin it according to their atheistic worldview.
Sure.
And let's talk about that. Let's focus on that. Let's talk about God.
Let me stop you real quick, and let me go to 2 parts with that, because I want to wrap up a little bit more of screenwriting and filmmaking. I want to do special effects just a little bit too. But before we do that, the part that I struggled with this was because God is so angry, hateful, vengeful, and not a benevolent God in any way, shape, or form. The reason it didn't connect for me with Moses, it's like, why would Moses want to go along for the ride? It was it was just so poorly done that he has this brotherly conflict and separation from Ramses, and he can't go back. But why is the mission of God remotely an option? It was just sort of like, you're not embracing any positive. You didn't communicate any upside to this at all. He's supposed to just feel guilt because they're, quote, being punished as slaves, but you got nothing. Baal's stoic. God is more evil than he is good. It didn't make any sense whatsoever. I think that's one of the reasons that it kind of falls so flat.
Yeah, it's an unsatisfying story, just from not even from the moral or Christian biblical worldview.
Right, trying to keep that out of it, right.
Story. Yeah, what you're saying is what everybody sees when they watch this film. It's like, well, why would you follow this God? He's a stupid God. He's a undesirable God. There's no connection going on there. And what we all long for as story watchers is we long for that human connection. We long for a dramatic connection, and there is none in the story, and that's where it falls flat. And it's really interesting because with all the hoopla about Noah made twice as much on its opening weekend as the Exodus did. So I suspect Exodus is going to do worse than Noah, even though Ridley Scott is, in general, a better filmmaker. I think that he blows it. He completely blows it in this movie.
He's really damaged his career because he's following Prometheus, which was a flop as well, even though I enjoy the movie itself, but I know exactly why it's a flop. And he's followed it with high expectations for a film like this, and it is a complete bust. There's no appeal at all for the Christian community at all, and word has gotten out, so now there'll be even more of a deterrent away from it. Then there's no word of mouth from the secular press. The secular press, this is just an awful and boring film. And let me go one step further with special effects. I was pretty much unimpressed when the highlight of the film for me from a special effects, visual effects part was the stuff falling off the side of a cliff that happens 2 hours and 20 minutes into the thing. That's a pretty sad Ridley Scott performance. I mean, there's some visuals there, but it's kind of a knockoff of, Peter Jackson stuff and some Avatar type technology, things like that. Nothing bad, but nothing great. The visual spectacular moment was, they can't go along the cavern on the side of a mountain. Things are falling off the side. It was beautifully done. It was incredible. It was intense. And that was pretty much it.
Well, for me personally, it was the parting of the Red Sea, which that was the more interesting one. I mean, he did the plagues, but you're right, it wasn't fantastic. It was kind of the crocodiles eating people, causing the Nile to turn red. Big crocodiles were cool, but you know what? Honestly, to be honest, that didn't bother me as much because I guess people might go for special effects, but I honestly didn't expect any more than what he gave me. I was more interested in a good story, good drama, good human relationship, and the special effects are always on top of that anyway. But if you don't have the human drama, then all you got is the special effects. So at least Transformers is keeps you active from the beginning to the end, so that you never stop to realize how stupid it is. But in this movie, it's just so long and dragging that by the time they show the plague, you're right, it's pretty unspectacular.
Yeah, I wanted to just mention it because people don't think that there's a lot of visual effects here that's worth seeing, because that's not it either, folks. There's nothing there that's that spectacular, that's that worth seeing. And then that's kind of what I was getting at. And we'll start with the plagues. That's a great place to transition because everyone knows the plague stories. And this fell so flat for me because they didn't have any scene of Moses going back and forth to the Pharaoh, explaining why there are plagues and pleading, let my people go. He wanted to stay away from the let people go montage so much that he loses the plot point, and it becomes a sort of a scientific explanation of the plagues of crocodiles making the Niles full of blood, and then the frogs have to flee the blood because flee the water because it's been saturated with the blood, and then of course they die out and insects come, and on and on and on. We don't care. We're just sitting there like, okay, let's get on with it. And then when Moses cares, God's angry, and it again doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, not only do we not care, but we don't know what's going on. Now, I think that those of us who know the story do.
Sure.
I think it's too much to assume that today's millennials know the story of Moses. Number one, and so you're watching this. The only moment we get is, Moses thinks he's supposed to do acts of terrorism in order to get free his people, and it's going to take too long. And God says, that's okay, but it's going to take too long to use terrorism. So let me do. So I will do what I want to do. And then we see the series of the plagues. So technically, you can say, okay, it's sort of explained, but you're right. It just becomes this long litany of these different plagues. And from a story perspective, there's just no progress of story to it.
Right.
And that's part of the power of the biblical story is it's making this point. But again, Ridley Scott has said he's an atheist. He said he does not believe in the miracles of the Bible. He never did, and his goal was to naturalize them to explain them away. So it makes sense that he would take God as much out of it as possible, make these things with a natural explanation, because that's his worldview. Now, I have to add a caveat here and say, I'm not entirely against quote, naturalizing miracles. And what I mean by that is, I don't believe miracles are absurdities. I believe that miracles are where God moves in an unusual way in nature, but that doesn't mean that it's absurd. And so, and the other thing is miracles, the Bible tells us that man who hates God will always figure out a way to reason away a miracle anyway. Even if someone comes back from the dead, they're not going to believe.
Sure.
So that I actually like the idea of giving unbelievers a reason to disbelieve, because that's kind of what they're going to do anyway. And so that didn't bother me as much, like the whole crocodile thing, because to me it's still a miracle. Because first of all, number one, it's timing. Secondly, it's like, well, crocodiles attacking people is not going to turn the whole river to blood and make it go on for days. So there's clearly a miracle there,
Oh, I thought it was a clever idea to string them together in a certain way, but without having Moses showing up or doing anything in between. It seems like you hit the nail on the head when you said Moses' idea was terrorism. God was, no, I got this. You're taking too long. Let me just really punish them. But the problem is it sounds like God sent one giant punishment, this giant sequence of events, and there was no interactions in between. That's where we got it totally derails from Scripture, because we have no empathy or mercy from God, where God was constantly going, please let my sacred people go, let my chosen people go, let my chosen people go. And the other thing I thought was strange is he never went down the sorcery road. The sorcerer always acted alone. There wasn't any, Moses and Aaron versus the Egyptian gods. He eliminated all of that, and I thought that was actually kind of a bizarre choice.
Well, again, no. You got to have the plagues because that's the heart of the story. You got to have the Red Sea because that's the heart of the story. But if you think about it, he pretty much took out all the miracles.
Sure.
Because he doesn't believe in them anyway. So, but that which would make the movie, look, even if you made the movie like a myth, it would still make the movie way cooler to have all those.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, the staff turning to a serpent. So again, bad, stupid choices. But of course, because he's an atheist, and that's what makes Hollywood stupid. Because they think, well, why don't you come watch the movies we make about your sacred stories that we rape and turn in and subvert and turn into our own naturalistic stories? Well, duh. Okay, but again, I want to give one more caveat. I want to give a nod to Scott in the sense that there was a moment during those plagues where his pseudo-scientists are pompously describing the natural causes of the effects, and they look like fools, and we all know they're fools. Yeah. So there is a sort of a nod to the miraculous nature there, which I have to give him credit for. But then, when you come to the Red Sea, well, I'm no theologian, but the word for dividing the sea is actually to break through. The Hebrew word could be a literary or poetic device that could actually fit a tsunami. So I personally like the tsunami idea. I don't think it's unbiblical, and I actually think that the way it was divided in the Ten Commandments movie, with Charlton Heston, is itself an interpretation that's no more biblical. So I like that in and of itself. It's still a miracle.
Well, you know which one I like. I know this is going to. I think I may have mentioned on this show before, so some folks may have heard me say, I enjoyed the cartoon Prince of Egypt, where it just does a tsunami effect, but then the wall kind of stays back. And I was really expecting something like that, where it would recede so far back and then come back like the perfect storm wave. So I'm sort of in between. I didn't hate the effect. I didn't hate the thing. I just hated that Moses came back to stand his ground against Ramses. I just didn't get that. That didn't show me anything about his character. Anyway, we're getting too far ahead from a almost spoiler effect, but.
Hey, your listeners probably know the whole story. Anyway. You can't ruin it. It's a bad movie.
It's a bad movie, guys. Shouldn't go see it. It's really $1.50 at a red box. Telling you.
I'm not saying a boycott. I'm just saying don't go see it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go to some of the theology, because obviously the biggest travesty here is how they portray God. God has a burning bush moment before he sort of is manifested through the voice of a child who sounds like a child that comes from a M. Night Shyamalan movie where he's just going to be angry and bitter, and it was very strange to get used to,
and a bad actor as well.
Well, he's a kid, so you don't know even what he was told to do or how he was told to perform, but it was just it was not good, and it didn't show any positive side of God. It really shows God as sort of if God were a child and he's angry and he's bitter and he wants his revenge, that's pretty much how God is portrayed, right?
Yep, exactly. So first of all, you come at this and say, well, first of all, disembodied voice of God, which is what again, that was the older movies. I acknowledge that that's not as visually interesting. I have all the sympathy in the world for how to deal with God, especially in a movie, without looking really, unbelievable, ridiculous. And in fact, in the Bible, God appears as what's called the Malachim Yahweh, which is the angel of Yahweh, and that is a man, that is an angel, that is a human form. So I don't have a problem with having a human form represent God. And but I think that Christians are fooling themselves if they think that it's a provocative and thoughtful thing to make it a child because we didn't expect that, and maybe we can get some insight from that. No, the fact is Ridley Scott thinks that the Old Testament, and he has said this, he thinks that the God of the Old Testament is pretty much vindictive, violent, and cruel, and childish.
Yeah.
And in so many words, he said that, and that's very much the Village Atheist critique of Richard Dawkins and all those guys that they call God a childish, vengeful, tribal deity, right? And so that's why I think it's clear that's why Ridley Scott is depicting God as a child, because that's what he thinks of this God. And of course, again, as we said, he's just a tantrum-throwing, vindictive little brat, spoiled brat who doesn't have any love, makes no promises to Moses, but like the God of the Bible, and there's no love or compassionate side to him, and he's cold, distant, and removed. This is all makes sense because Ridley Scott is an atheist who doesn't know God, of course, and his writers. Of course they're going to write the God that way because they don't know what it means to experience God, and they have no understanding of that. To them, it's all just a delusion. And so that's why it makes sense that the first time Moses meets God, it's because he gets knocked in the head and almost drowned in a mudslide. See, because that sort of makes it this, well, is it a vision or is it just a hallucination in his head? And then every time he sees God, no one else does. Yeah, that's okay. In and of itself, that's okay. But the consistency throughout the story is really there could be no difference between. Now, this is where it's very much like Noah. If you look at this, even the reality of the plagues in the Red Sea, that's the only. Just like in Noah, the flood is the one thing you say. Yeah, but the flood happened. Yeah, but the Red Sea happened. Okay, but realistically, or if you pull back from a big picture standpoint, the God in the movie Exodus, there's not any difference between just a religious experience of something that doesn't exist, and that's what it is. I mean, the God of the movie is very questionably existent in and of himself, let alone the fact that he's blasphemously, hateful and vindictive. So these are the elements that are going to make Christians hate this movie, even if they don't know it, even if they can't think of it consciously. But I think we're more sophisticated in our movie going now. I think Christians are going to say that and go, come on, this is ridiculous.
Well, and more importantly, obviously, depending on where you are in the gradient of your Christian tolerance, folks. I mean, maybe you're able to, but obviously, the first group, if you're remotely hung up with the TV miniseries, the Bible, on all the little inaccuracies, Exodus will make your head explode. So just don't even bother. You won't even be able to get through 20 minutes before you'll have issues, let alone when you get to the action sequences and Moses interacting with God. But then when you get to deeper theology, you're a Sunday school teacher, you're trying to go, reach out to young people, those kinds of things. This is just so slanted, as Brian is explaining and detailing from the atheist perspective, of the Hollywood perspective on things, to naturalize things, to make earthly explanations for things. We don't need God, and whatever God is in existence, or what we believe in God, is marginalized as an angry child. And that's pretty much Exodus in a nutshell as far as I've seen it. And Brian Godawa is an expert on these things, so I want to have him on. But I do want to close, though. I want to give Brian a chance to talk about his latest book. I know we talked about it extensively before, but let's give Brian a chance to talk about it, because he's a writer as well. He takes some creative liberty with backstories and creative stuff, but he stays true to the biblical thing. And the latest one is called David Ascendant. And Brian, give everybody a little overview of the book, but also kind of how your approach is to that and how that differs from a movie like Exodus.
Sure. Well, actually, the more relevant book is the two books before David, which is Joshua Valiant and Caleb Vigilant. because it's the story of Moses and Joshua as they enter into the Promised Land. So if you are fed up and disgusted with the movie Exodus, you want to get a refreshing biblical take that also is very imaginative. Check out. It's kind of like Joshua Valiant is the sequel to Exodus, so it starts after the Exodus, and that has a very human Moses, very sinful. He's sinful, but God is loving and God is just, but God is also, he's just and he also punishes. So it's got that biblical balance. But the latest release that I have is David Ascendant, just released last month, and that's the story of King David. It's the story of his rise to become a king. Most people, when they think of David, they think of David and Goliath or David and Bathsheba. Mine takes place in the first half of David's life, and it does include Goliath. But what's so unique about this take that no one will have read this take on David before is it's part of a series called Chronicles of the Nephilim, where I'm retelling all the stories in the Bible that are connected to giants. And guess what, folks? Goliath is not the only giant in the Bible, and he's not the only giant in King David's story. There's actually 5 other giants that are written of in Samuel and Chronicles. And in context, these giants are hunting King David. He wasn't king at the time, but they were hunting David in order to kill him. Why? What's going on here? Well, there's a war between the seed of the serpent and the seed of Eve, and which is the messianic line, which rises up in King David. And these seed of the serpent, these Nephilim, these giants in the Bible, are part of that plan. So I tell that story, and I tell the story of these giants hunting him and how David's mighty men battle back. So it's got action, romance with David's wives. It's got, it's rated PG-13, so beware. Don't give it to your young child to read. But it'll open up the David story for you in a way that will be refreshing, that you've never seen before, and it'll drive you back to the scriptures. And for those of you who want to know more about how biblical it is, I put an appendix at the back of the book where I reveal a lot of my research that the story is based on, so you can appreciate that as well. So check that out. Everything's on Amazon. You can get it in audiobook, Kindle ebook, or paperback, whatever, at Amazon.com.
We'll link to all that, folks, as always. You make sure you get your copy. Support Brian and his amazing work and extremely entertaining stories. I definitely highly, highly recommend them. And as always, Brian is always so insightful. It's always so much fun to talk to you and chat movies and pop culture and that kind of thing. Thanks for fitting us into your schedule.
Likewise, Brandon.